Council meeting of Tuesday, November 23rd, 2021. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and thank them for having cared for this land and look forward to working together with them in partnership as we continue to build this great city together. I also want to take a moment to recognize the immense contributions of the City of Vancouver staff who work hard every day to help make our city an incredible place to live, work, and play. Clerk, may we have the roll call, please?
Yes, Mayor Stewart is absent on civic business. Deputy Mayor Carr is in the chair. Councillor DeGenova.
Present.
Councillor Fry.
Physically here.
Councillor Swanson.
Here.
Councillor Hardwick.
Present.
Councillor Wiebe.
Present.
Councillor Boyle.
Present.
Councillor Dominato. Councillor Bly is on leave of absence for civic business. And Councillor Kirby-Young.
Present.
The meeting has quorum, Deputy Mayor Carr.
Thank you. This special council meeting has been called in accordance with section 14.5 of the procedure bylaw. The purpose of the meeting is to enable a panel discussion and dialogue with national and international city builders to discuss emerging directions for the Vancouver plan. A reminder to you all, no decision is required of council today. The ideas and input shared today will assist staff in creating the draft Vancouver plan, which is anticipated to be presented to council in March of 2022. Note that public speakers will not be heard at today's meetings, but may view the proceedings online or attend in person at City Hall. It's important to highlight the significant and meaningful public engagement on this phase of the Vancouver plan started in October and is currently taking place through to the end of November. Today's meeting is not a substitute for upcoming and previous robust public engagement. Remind council that questions pertaining to specific rezoning or development proposals are not to be discussed here to ensure appropriate regulatory procedures are maintained. As this meeting is taking place in a different format from typical council meetings, council must consider suspending certain rules in the procedure bylaw and implement other rules for the duration of the meeting in order to help facilitate open dialogue and idea sharing. So for this portion, we need a motion to suspend Rule 6.2 of the procedure bylaw for the remainder of the meeting. Section 6.2 refers to speaking at a council meeting. Suspension of this rule will provide for informal and open dialogue during the workshop. Council may, by a vote of 2/3 of council members present, without debate, suspend a rule for the remainder of the meeting or a portion of the meeting. Would someone like to move a motion to suspend Rule 6.2 of the procedure bylaw for the workshop portion of this meeting?
Motion to suspend.
So moved.
Okay, I think I heard Councillor Dominato move, and Councillor, I think it was Hardwick, seconded. All in favor?
Yay.
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Great, the motion carries. Before we start, a few reminders. The public can follow along on Twitter at VanCityClerk for updates on the progress of the meeting. Members of the public may send comments to council by using the online web form listed in the meeting agenda. So council, we have a full session today. We'll hear more about the specific format in a moment from our moderator. To keep within the designated time, meeting time of 3 to 5 p.m., so 2 hours, and to maximize the opportunity for this dialogue between council and panelists, our moderator will be facilitating council's questions in clusters or groups of 2 to 3 based on themes following the panelist presentations. A reminder that your questions should be clear and concise. It's suggested that council prioritize your top 2 to 3 questions to help facilitate an effective dialogue and the participatory process. The panelist roundtable at the end of the workshop will not involve opportunities for questions. City staff are here today as well. However, in order to best utilize the panel's time, please send any questions to staff via email after the workshop. To provide context on the Vancouver Plan Emerging Directions and current fall engagement, I would like to invite Susan Haid, Deputy Director, Long Range Planning, and Andrew Pask, Planner, Vancouver Plan, to provide a brief introductory presentation. And I do see Andrew Pask at the podium, so welcome.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Carr, and I'm here actually, Susan's joining me on this side here, but I'm going to carry on with the presentation for for your benefit and to try to provide a little bit of context to the work that we've done to date. So I'm just going to do a quick screen share here, make sure that shows up okay for everyone. All right. So thank you again. As mentioned, my name is Andrew Pask. I'm a planner in the planning department working on the Vancouver plan. And just to start, really to center us, I wanted to build on your land acknowledgement, Deputy Mayor, and affirm the centrality of reconciliation to our work in planning. As part of the Vancouver plan process, we've established partnerships with each of the nations as well as urban Indigenous communities to work together in developing policies, strategies, and actions for the Vancouver plan. And through this effort, we are working collaboratively to advance the City of Reconciliation. By way of quick recap, this is the third Special Council workshop in support of the Vancouver plan. Our first two sessions featured local and regional voices talking about long-term planning and growth, as well as the important perspective of Council's many advisory committees. Today, we shift to hear some perspectives from national and international city builders whose work touches on some of the key Vancouver plan themes. In 2022, we'll be back for a couple more sessions with local city builders and others. As you know, the Vancouver plan process is all about creating the city's first comprehensive citywide land use plan. Council launched the planning process in 2019. We've undertaken 2 phases of planning so far. The first focused on early listening and learning opportunities. The second on the identification of key issues and areas of focus. This third phase of planning, the one that we're in right now, has a focus on emerging directions, on looking at early policy and land use ideas and testing that with the community. The intention ultimately is to produce a land use vision with key policies that help to support that vision. And our work at this stage really focuses on 3 broad topics, 3 foundational principles that are at the center of our work on the plan: reconciliation, equity, and resilience. 3 big ideas that help to ground policy, focusing on equitable housing in complete neighborhoods, an economy that works for all, climate protection, and restored ecosystems. And 3 areas of change that we think reflect significant opportunities in our discussions around how the city might grow and change. That is our neighborhood shopping areas, our transit neighborhoods, the areas within a 10-minute walk or roll of a transit station or corridor, and our low-density residential areas. And by way of quick update on the Phase 3 engagement process, we are now moving into the last week of what has been a month-long engagement effort that has involved a number of tactics and activities. It started with the Council-informed postcard that raised awareness of the process and which was mailed, addressed mail to over 300,000 homes and businesses. The process has moved through several engagement activities, workshops, focused conversations, surveys, an online open house, stakeholder events, and more. And to date, we've heard from several thousand people about their ideas for the future of the city. Some key themes, just to provide a bit of an update, sort of mid-process here or near the end of the process. We've asked people about their priorities and to help us sort through some of the early priorities that were identified. Lots and lots of ideas about how we might further prioritize topics for growth and change. And perhaps not surprising, some of these key themes include rental and missing middle housing, which we've heard a lot about, ensuring easier access to daily and weekly needs, neighborhood character, ecosystem protection, people-friendly streets, public spaces. Also a lot about how we might land some of the core principles, equity, reconciliation, and resilience on ground, making sure that we're talking about action, not just words. Beyond that, I would like to give a very brief update on the survey figures. The survey, of course, is ongoing, so these are figures as of the 21st. They are dynamic in that sense. There are some key areas of attention through the survey process where more significant community support is being registered, and I wanted to alert you to some of those. They deal with things like more housing choice, including rental, linking housing to neighborhood amenities, ensuring in particular that there are options for low and medium income households. Also the importance of ensuring neighborhood elements, lots of emphasis on the importance of grocery, transit, public space, places to eat and drink, opportunities for community and sociability, the importance of job space and making sure that we have a diversity of spaces in neighborhoods, and the real need to dial into climate policy interventions to support the climate emergency response and green infrastructure. In addition to that, we've also done some testing around the areas of potential change and the form that might take place. We've asked people how they think growth might take place. Should we be focusing our growth on a more nodal or concentrated sense, or should we be looking at more of a distributed approach? For transit neighborhoods and neighborhood shopping areas, a lot of interest in a more distributed approach there, you can see in some of the figures. With residential areas, a lot of agreement again that there should be more housing choices within low-density neighborhoods, and once again, a lot of emphasis on missing middle approaches, plexes, townhomes, low-rise apartments up to 6 stories. Just a few last notes. We are, as I noted in our last week, we've got upcoming activities. I just wanted to let folks in the audience know we've got workshops this week. We've got young planners activities. Our City Lab storefront is still open. There's an online survey that is open, as well as a self-guided webinar and virtual open house. And very shortly, we'll be launching an Ipsos Reid survey to test some of the same questions with a representative sample. You can find all of this and more at vancouverplan.ca. So I hope that gives a little bit of context or additional context for our conversation today. With that, I'll turn the floor back to you, Deputy Mayor.
Well, I think that that's the complete presentation. Great. So thank you for that update. And actually, we do look forward to always getting reports from you. So on the fall engagement, I guess that will be an upcoming report back, and that'll be very welcome. So I would now like to turn things over to Alex Bozikovic, architecture and planning critic, Globe and Mail, who is here to moderate today's session. Alex will provide an overview of today's workshop and a few opening remarks. So over to you, Alex. Alex, you might be muted.
I am. There's an auspicious start. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Deputy Mayor Carr, and thanks to everyone. Hello from cold and dark Toronto. It's good to be here with you. I find myself in kind of an unusual position as a journalist here, moderating this conversation, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing how this goes and to seeing how the plan unfolds. So I've been asked to just introduce some themes to set up the conversation, but I also just want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we go any further. I think Andrew has probably made this clear, but we're going to be, after the panelists have finished speaking, we're going to be doing questions in groups. So counselors, if you have a question on the economy, for instance, I'll see if there are 1 or 2 other questions along a similar theme that I can group together and present them to the panelists as one. So counselors, if you could either raise your hand or use your chat function to indicate a question, I'll keep an eye on those to try and gather them together and just keep the discussion flowing as smoothly as we can, and relay your questions to the panel. I also am going to, I will certainly make sure that each counselor has a chance to ask at least 1 question of the panel. And I have been asked to try and use the expertise of our panelists as best I can through that hour of discussion. Got a couple of advanced questions as well that have come in from counselors, and I will share those with the panel. I am going to now, if I can figure out how to, I'm going to share my screen and show a few images. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes? Right. Looking at a grainy photo of the West End in the late 1950s, just as the process of intensification was starting. I bring this up because, it suggests just how cities can change and cities have changed. I think it's difficult for a lot of us, wherever we sit, sometimes to understand just how true that is. I think at this moment in history, it is easy to feel as though the status quo, is unchallengeable, and the status quo has always been there, when of course that is not the case. I, as a journalist, became interested in planning. And by the way, planning is not in my job title, but it may as well be now. I became interested in planning as a set of issues over the last few years and wound up co-editing this book together with a sometime Vancouverite, Annabelle Vaughn, and a couple of other good folks, which is about planning in Toronto. It's called House Divided, and the subtitle, which I won't stand by, is How the Missing Middle Can Solve Toronto's Housing Crisis. Um, this was a few years ago now, a little bit earlier in the conversation, at least here in Toronto, which is continuing to evolve. This book was a combination sort of history of the issue and introduced a series of potential solutions for intensification within neighborhoods, including this one, which was, I believe, an award winner through a competition that Urbanarium held a few years ago. This is a design by Workshop Architecture, which is called Vancouver Extra Special, I believe. And the reason that we did this book, and the reason that I, as a journalist, first became interested in this set of issues is partly because I saw a discussion around zoning happening in a number of places across North America, including in Vancouver and in California, but also in Toronto, that this issue and the consequences of the history of zoning were starting to become very clear. So this is a map which depicts a pattern which may or may not be familiar to you. This is Toronto. The green areas have grown in population between 1971 and 2016, and the purple areas have shrunk. So I'm sitting here today in one of those purple areas just to the west of downtown, which has a population roughly 40% lower now than it did half a century ago, despite being, in every measurable way, one of the best served and most amenity rich places in the city and indeed in the entire country. Of course, this is also true for Vancouver. This graphic is generated by Jens van Bergman based on census data, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before or similar ones, but again, the green is growth, the purple is shrinkage, and the height of the bar represents the scale of the change. So what's happened downtown is very clear, and in select other specific areas around the city and across the region, and then there are those big gaps in between. So, I think it's important to understand that these issues are not unique to Vancouver or unique to Vancouver and Toronto, not by any means. There are similar issues happening and similar discussions happening in jurisdictions across North America and indeed beyond. This is an article from Slate I believe it's 2 or 3 years old at this point, that addresses one of the sort of driving factors, which is demographic change. Old buildings house fewer people than they did 50 years ago. This is true in Vancouver. It is true in New York City. It is true in a lot of places. And that is due to a number of factors that are pretty consistent across the West. People have smaller families. People are more affluent and occupy more space than they used to. Individual homeowners are less likely to either live multi-generationally, are less likely either to live multi-generationally or to share their homes with tenants or boarders. You put all of these things together, along with a number of other social and economic factors, and you wind up with cities that look the same, but are in fact losing people. And that, every time I make that point to someone talking about Toronto or about Vancouver, sometimes even speaking to architects and people in the field, they are shocked by this. That map that shows the city, big chunks of the city is shrinking, even as the city as a whole continues to grow rapidly, is very counterintuitive, which makes it an interesting story. It also makes it, I think, a difficult policy issue for planners and leaders to address. And just to reinforce the point that this is a widespread pattern, these graphics are generated by the New York Times last year. The purple represents areas in these American cities that are zoned only for detached single family homes. So, the analogy to Vancouver is not exact, but, the pattern is also not dissimilar. So this whole discussion around the demographic change in cities and the relationship between planning regulations and social change has become a really live one in the last couple of years, even since I personally began to engage with this issue. It heated up last year as well, both with the effects of the pandemic, in which the rich got richer and the poor got evicted, and with the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. A number of people in the US have been more actively tracing the links between planning policies of the past and economic segregation and racial segregation. These things are linked. They were, in the 1910s and 1920s, and in the decades that followed, they were in the United States and in Canada explicitly linked at times. And even where they weren't explicitly linked, there is a legacy there, both in terms of race and economics, that continues to be with us today. So the conversation continues. This is from earlier this year in Atlanta, where that city and the region is still trying to address the same issue that is before you today. So I guess there are a number of questions that come together when you talk about planning policy, particularly about housing and its regulation. One of them is economics. I know there's a very live discussion in Vancouver about the relationship between adding new housing and affordability for different people. From what I understand, within the economics profession, this question is not actually controversial. It's controversial in terms of the specific impacts of adding new housing supply and how the negative consequences of building new housing in particular neighborhoods, what those consequences are and how they can be managed. In terms of the broad question of, whether new housing is a good thing or not, that is basically settled. However, I don't think that, I realize the politics continue to be more complex. And I think it's also interesting that in this plan, Vancouver's planners are looking at a number of other different lenses. I think these lenses apply to the city and also apply to other large cities. The most obvious one to my mind is climate. We're looking here at a map based on data generated by scientists at the University of California, Berkeley, of the American Northeast Corridor. And what we're looking at is essentially the carbon footprint, to use that term, of individual households. And the gap between the green and the red is roughly a factor of 3. In other words, people who live within cities, not as opposed to in the most distant suburbs, are generating roughly 1/3 the emissions per household of their counterparts. And this pattern holds true in Toronto, it holds true in Vancouver, it holds true pretty much everywhere in North America for a couple of reasons. One, because many emissions are linked to transportation, which for the most part means vehicle miles traveled. And another one is housing size. That, as people live closer together, essentially apartments wind up being more efficient than houses are. So, I know Vancouver in its planning has led the way, I think, over the last couple of years, articulating this as an issue and connecting the form of housing and the form of cities with carbon emissions. And so I guess excuse me for a moment, please. I guess what I find interesting here, and the question that's before me is that I see as interesting, is how Vancouver is going to react to its current the current policy challenge that's in front of you here. If you look at the city, it's very clear to see where growth hasn't happened and where growth has happened. And again, this is not unique to Vancouver, but there are similar or analogous situations in basically every big city that I know of. And I think we're at a moment in history when policymakers and leaders are, forced to confront this question of whether this pattern of growth that we're looking at here actually makes sense, and if not, what else would work. So I guess if Vancouverism was this, for a generation, largely in the downtown, the question now is what the next Vancouverism is, or what Vancouverism that addresses the whole city and addresses this new set of challenges is going to look like. Thank you. I will leave it there. Go ahead.
I do think that, Alex, are you not introducing panelists and presentations, or? Okay.
I'm going to. I'm sorry. Just give me 1 second here. I just had a bit of a distraction. I do have kids in the house, and people don't always remember the rules when daddy's on a call. So excuse me for a moment.
We have counselors in that same position, so no problem.
Be right back with you. There you go. Okay, I'm back with you. Excellent. So I'm just going to do a quick run through introducing the three panelists quickly, and then we can get into their talks. I think it tends to flow a little bit more easily if we just introduce everybody at once. So I'll start by introducing Solomon Wong, who is the president and CEO of Intervistas. He is a multidisciplinary expert on transportation policies, transportation economy, and innovation. Through his consulting work, he focuses on designing process improvements for goods and passengers. Re-engineering flows of people and goods to a journey to newer ways of mobility, he has helped to implement solutions for a range of private and public sector clients. He also sits on the board of the Canadian American Border Trade Alliance. He has a Master of Science in Planning from the University of Toronto. We'll also be hearing from Andre Brumfield. Andre is design director at Gensler, the major architecture firm Gensler, where he focuses on revitalizing and repositioning urban environments through urban design, master planning, and architecture. His experience includes redevelopment in emerging urban districts, neighborhood and community revitalization, citywide master planning, and corporate campuses. He also has extensive experience in mixed income housing. And first will be Patty Rios, who is the executive director of New Cities. Patty is a global leader in promoting well-being through the design of the city, applying a human-centered approach and developing participatory engagement opportunities. Her multi-lens approach comes from a background in architecture, urban design, ethnography, and public policy. Before joining New Cities, she was the housing policy expert and research lead at Happy City, where Patty led the Happy Homes initiative aimed at boosting social well-being in multi-unit housing. Patty also lectures on urban policy at UBC. So, Patty, hi, welcome. Would you like to kick us off, please?
Hi, thank you so much, Alex. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this workshop. I'll just try to share my screen, hoping that everything is working. Let's see. If you can let me know if you can see my screen, that would be great.
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and honor with gratitude the land and the people who have stewarded through generations. I want to start today by sharing a short story with you. I'm originally from Mexico City, and over the course of my life, I've experienced 5 earthquakes. One of the most devastating ones took place 4 years ago in September 2017. 44 buildings collapsed, 330 people died, and 6,000 people were hurt. While all Mexicans remember this event as one of the worst natural disasters, some of us also remember it as one of the most unbelievable displays of community strength and resilience. It took the government a few hours to align its response. Regardless, we got organized and helped. People created human chains to remove rubble from collapsed buildings. Corner store owners provided water and food. Health centers occupied public spaces, and seniors created improvised pop-up daycares. Here's where the story is relevant for Vancouver. Not every neighborhood in Mexico City had the same reaction capacity. It was the denser mixed use with a greater ratio of public space, physically and socially connected communities that responded in a matter of minutes. It was in neighborhoods where people often cycle that community members were able to transport medicines and emergency supplies, dodging the rubble from collapsed buildings. But overall, the earthquake taught us that neighborhoods where people knew each other and had strong social networks were more likely to take care of their community and support the most vulnerable ones. We fast forward into 2021 after the earthquake, a pandemic, and after the recent floods that communities across BC have experienced. And there's one lesson that sticks with me. We have to design cities that prioritize the creation of strong social networks that enable each community to respond, building on their assets and addressing their unique needs. This lesson actually goes beyond the planning and design of neighborhoods and focuses on enabling communities to support and elevate each other. Today, Vancouver has a unique opportunity to create a citywide plan that meets people where they are and truly builds on equity and reconciliation. In order to do so, it's important to ask ourselves, who are we planning for? And how are we contributing to build socially connected and resilient neighborhoods? In terms of who? The Vancouver Plan is identifying underserved populations and has incorporated those who were most impacted during the pandemic. It would be important to go beyond collected disaggregating data and listen to their stories and insights. Meaningful engagement can inform the plan, but it can also create agency and stewardship and allow people to develop strong social connections. I encourage the city to focus on building trust, empathy, and compassion. That way, we will be creating the foundations of a caring city. That way, we will also be leading. That way, we will also be leading with the foundational values of equity and reconciliation and provide communities a real shot at collective resilience. This takes me to the second lesson. How are we contributing to building socially connected and resilient neighborhoods? The way we plan and design our neighborhoods can bring people closer together. While good strategies are emerging from the engagement process in the Vancouver plan, we need to identify the actions that intersect in equity, reconciliation, and resilience to prioritize the needs of underserved communities and vulnerable populations. We can achieve this by providing access to core needs and also enabling communities to choose what matters the most to them. Within providing access to core needs, I want to focus on housing. The way we plan and design our homes can help us connect with neighbors, build stronger social connections, and resilience. The first key point is that we need to provide housing options not just throughout the affordable housing spectrum, but throughout the overall housing continuum, including transitional housing, supportive housing, below market, and a wide array of affordable options. The second point, yes, absolutely, focus on missing middle. As we explore this approach, we will need to focus on design, tenure, and the concept of affordable living. From the design perspective, including different types of units and a wide variety of bedrooms will allow us to address the needs of different households configurations, even multi-generational families and people who are not part of the same family but are living together. Providing tenure options, maximizing rentals, and enabling innovative home ownership. Besides including below market rentals and social housing along arterials and TODs, we can actually choose to locate this close to parks and public spaces to reduce their exposure to proximity to noise and pollution. That has been one of the equity issues that renters have faced. These different types of tenure can enable residents to stay in the same neighborhood and age in place. And shift our focus into affordable living. Daycare options, affordable grocery stores, and access to the public space network, among other actions, will allow us to support caregivers and venture into the shared economy, which is often left behind when we focus on major office uses in key business districts. As we create an approach to have a more equitable use of the land, it will be crucial to understand that we can have the best intentions to provide below market and supportive housing across neighborhoods, but without the right services, support services, and developing regulations, we will create just temporary patches and low-income residents will be forced to leave their homes once again. My last point, we need to make space for the community to choose what matters the most to them. This means that neighborhoods will have different characteristics. Communities need to decide what are the spaces that actually bring them together. In this vein, I encourage planners to embrace a new approach to neighborhood design, to move away from hard indicators and instead embrace performance-oriented metrics. Embracing diversity in Vancouver requires us to understand that the same goal can be achieved in different ways. This image is a clear example of this. The goal is to bring people closer together. While a community will choose space for artistic expression, other communities will prioritize gathering and dancing. Embracing these differences and each community's right to self-determination will start building the Vancouver that we all want to live in. Thank you. I'll pass it over to you, Alex.
All right, Patty, thank you very much. Thank you for introducing us to those ideas. And a useful theoretical point as well, the idea of the housing continuum, the idea that housing for all people in different situations of different family sizes and at different income levels is all connected, and that there are relationships between what we might think of as entirely different forms of housing. So along with your ideas, thank you for spelling that out for us. Let's move now to Andre. Andre, could you take it away, please?
Sure. Let's see, after 21 months, hopefully I'll be able to make this transition to share my screen. Let me know when you can see it. Hopefully you can see it now.
Yes.
Yep, looking
we
good.
can see it now.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, first, that's a very tough act to follow with Patty in her presentation. And second, I'd like to thank Andrew Pask and the City of Vancouver for inviting me to participate on this panel with this group of esteemed professionals and experts. I'm very happy to be here, and again, thank you for your time. There's a number of things that I would like to cover in my 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll try to go through this in a good time. But one of the focuses that I wanted to talk about, or things I wanted to talk about, was the idea of the 20-minute city. And this is not to talk about what it is or what it is not, whether it's a 15-minute city or 20-minute city. We all get the concept and know the concept. And we all know that this concept is nothing new. Paris, Melbourne, London, a number of cities in Europe across the country have been looking at the 20-minute city and what this means from a pedestrian standpoint, ways to reduce vehicles and how to balance better pedestrian-friendly streets and access to open spaces in our cities and our neighborhoods. Here in the United States, it's been looked at through the lens of smart growth and climate action, at least with the city of Portland. And they are not the only city. Dallas, it's about managing sprawl, something that Vancouver knows all too well. It's been doing quite well, if you will, for the past generation or so. And with Detroit, the idea of repopulating neighborhoods, which is something that I'll come back to. The one thing that the 20-minute neighborhood or the concept has not done is talked about what this means in terms of how it could be applied to Black neighborhoods or brown neighborhoods or really underserved neighborhoods in our cities. And if we were to look at these icons, especially the ones that are crossed out, when we talk about 20-minute neighborhoods in Black neighborhoods or underserved neighborhoods, it rings hollow because a number of our neighborhoods don't have these assets or these amenities to begin with. So how can we actually start to talk about creating 20-minute neighborhoods in our Black neighborhoods or in our underserved neighborhoods to bring much needed investment so we can actually take off some of these lines in a number of these amenities and actually talk about how we think about strategic neighborhoods to create a holistic and balanced and more equitable city. So that's the conversation I'll be having, or at least the presentation I'll be giving over the next few minutes, and the idea of rethinking a 20-minute neighborhood through the lens of equity, particularly as it relates to our underserved communities. And just a few points that I wanted to highlight as the slide transitions. The idea of neighborhood-based retail, local retail, and actually how it actually serves our communities and what it means to our communities is really one of the lifebloods of how vibrant a neighborhood can be. So, but what does it mean in terms of not only as we get on the other side of COVID, but also as we get as a means of shopping, how we access our goods? What does it mean when we talk about retail or commercial development and mixed use development as a whole? And I just want to spend a few minutes or a few slides, if you will, talking about an initiative that we are very honored to be working with Commissioner Maurice Cox and also the mayor's office here at the city of Chicago. It's through the Invest Southwest program, which focuses on pushing investment into our underserved neighborhoods on the southwest side, south and west sides of the city. And this is a project we were just awarded the Ave. And the idea of how we think about commercial and retail development beyond just providing places for people to shop. You'll notice in the corner here, NHS as Neighborhood Housing Services, they've been doing a lot of work here for the past 3 generations in this challenged neighborhood on Chicago's west side. We wanted to make sure that they had an anchor here in the neighborhood as part of this mixed use and mixed income development. We also wanted to provide health and wellness, and we're actually the owner is in deep conversation with Aetna to provide health care and health facilities that are actually geared toward reaching the neighborhood and reaching those residents who live here and providing preventative ways of treating their patients as opposed to dealing with their immediate illness that they may have. So again, how do we think about mixed use development in a mixed income setting? This building does introduce 42 units of mixed income housing, but the idea of actually that ground floor getting beyond kind of the food and beverage, but really providing different services that are not only on the ground floor, but also on the second floor. And we also are in extensive conversations with the YMCA, who wants to be coupled and be part of this this partnership here. The idea of health, wellness, and institutions that are really critical to our neighborhoods are something that we want to make sure they're a part of our mixed income developments that we're actually looking at doing. And the larger thought is that how do we actually make this an expressive form of through the arts, and how does that actually reflect it and the spirit of the community reflected through architecture and through urban design and through planning. And this speaks to one of the local artists that we'll be working with who will be part of this effort. But the idea of thinking about this more than just a building, more than just another mixed income project that is actually offering different services. This is what we feel is going to be the first development that's really going to spark new development and revitalization on this part of Chicago's west side. Again, getting beyond the building, but thinking about a larger strategic corridor plan that speaks to urban infill, new development, commercial development, and additional resources to go beyond housing that actually can support the larger neighborhood. Um, but then the idea of actually what does this mean in terms of inclusive growth? This is a neighborhood that's lost a lot of population, something that I'll be touching on here in a few slides as it relates to how we think about repopulating our neighborhoods. The idea of employment centers, and this is a map of Chicago, and this is not suggesting that we would focus on deconcentrating our central business districts, at least here in North America, but the idea of how we can actually push neighborhood employment into or employment centers into our neighborhoods to really talk about how we actually can bring those employment opportunities to those distressed neighborhoods where we can actually reduce travel time, reduce vehicle miles traveled, but then also provide a walkable environment by providing employment opportunities in our neighborhoods. And we've been doing just that, working with Ford Motor Companies in Detroit as they're actually looking at relocating a portion of their headquarters into Corktown, which has actually been a distressed neighborhood just east of downtown Detroit. And we're also doing work, and this is not a great rendering, with Discover, where they're actually looking at taking over an abandoned retail box on Chicago's South Side, Chatham neighborhood, predominantly Black and Latino, and bringing up to 400 jobs into this distressed neighborhood. The idea of, again, providing employment opportunities, bringing employment centers to our neighborhoods, as opposed to focusing on the traditional employment centers that are located in the heart of our cities and also in our larger region. The idea of affordable and mixed income housing and what that means. It's been great to hear a lot of conversation about, what this means in terms of density, what this means in terms of missing middle. This is a handful of a number of our mixed income projects and affordable housing projects that we're doing in Chicago and other parts of the country. But the idea of what this means in terms of trying to create the missing middle, something that we've heard about earlier today or this evening. Minneapolis, I think, has done an incredible job of actually eliminating single family zoning, which will actually now allow for that missing middle to come into the traditionally single family zone neighborhoods to provide broader housing types to people who actually want to live in a neighborhood. But then also not only the idea of creating the missing middle, but in places like Chicago, Philadelphia, how do we actually preserve that missing middle? A number of our neighborhoods have been gentrifying, where a number of these housing types have actually been converted to single-family homes and townhomes away from our six flats or three flats or walk-up apartments. So how do we, in a number of our cities, preserve the missing middle to provide those broad range of housing types that we know are critical? One of the projects that we're been working on going into phase one construction, which is in Knoxville, Tennessee, a former public housing site, which we've now provided 440 units of mixed income housing, offering housing types for families of all incomes, but also offering a range of housing types that are located just outside of the downtown. I know I'm going over time here, but I'll speed this up a little bit. Transit-oriented development we know is critical. We've had the pleasure of working with the city of Brampton, and Alex, you hopefully will appreciate this, which is a suburb just outside of Toronto, on their larger 2040 plan, and it's focused around transit-oriented development and the new investment that they're making to manage growth. And the idea of actually creating equitable development by providing a broad range of housing types to actually service a broad range of people that will be coming to Brampton and larger Toronto as a whole is something that we've been working again with the city with for the past year and a half or so. And ironically, we're presenting to City Council this Friday. Last couple points I'd like to make is the idea of how we can actually not only get more of the assets in our challenged and underserved neighborhoods, but how can we actually talk about how we share these assets across neighborhoods? If you think about employment opportunities, healthcare, grocery store, access to transportation, those don't have to be in one neighborhood, but they could be servicing a number of neighborhoods that are bordering. And the idea of kind of getting beyond design and really understanding our neighborhoods, understanding it from an income standpoint, understanding it from a population standpoint, understanding it from housing in terms of rental versus ownership, these indicators are really important for us as urban designers and architects to really work with the public and private sector to understand how we can actually bring about change. And last but not least, the idea of how we actually talk about repopulating our neighborhoods, not just our Black neighborhoods, but our neighborhoods that have actually been losing population as our cities have our districts have been shifting. How do we actually talk about ways that we can actually create a more equitable city that actually provides neighborhoods of choice for all of our residents, so we don't have to deal with gentrification issues or don't have to deal with declining population of any ethnic group in our cities. So again, thank you for your time. The idea of how we think about equity, I know that is a broad term, but with that, we can continue the conversation. And Alex, I'd like to turn it back to you.
Andre, thanks so much. Thank you in particular for bringing together the idea of mixed use and contemplating the idea of mixed use and the idea of the 15-minute neighborhood or the 20-minute neighborhood. Interesting to hear how you are working on this program in Chicago, which I'm very interested in, which aims to bring together amenities and retail, not just as sources of economic development, but also as community anchors. A really interesting idea that is not all that familiar these days. Let's move on to Solomon. And are you ready? Solomon?
Yeah, I will share a presentation shortly, but
Thanks so
just
much.
by way of introduction, I'm born and raised in Vancouver, and as Alex mentioned, I was trained in urban planning at U of T. But in dealing with my work itself, the area that I've been very fortunate to participate in is an innovation ecosystem associated with transportation and processes. And I'll get to that in a second because it's also given me the opportunity to travel around the world. And every city that I've gone to, I've really made a point of visiting innovation centers to be able to look at how the mechanisms for space to create new ideas actually work in different cities. But the other aspect that's also quite challenging for the Vancouver plan is fundamentally what we need to wrestle with in Vancouver is our place in being a gateway city, and a gateway city in terms of a conduit for goods moving through the city to other parts of North America and vice versa, a gateway city in terms of what it is for ideas and people to flow through, and wrestling with what that will mean from an economic perspective going forward. And it's a challenging one just because there are a lot of externalities associated with gateway activities, but there's also the power to be able to share more in terms of the kinds of game-changing ideas that innovators in the area can build in terms of problems we have. So very humble, small role in terms of the Vancouver innovation ecosystem, just to illustrate what I mean. First, starting off with problems, lineups in transportation, lost time, pollution, a lot of paper waste. I had the opportunity in 2006 to help build a set of solutions that helped to create a much faster process through borders that led to major policy changes for both the United States and Canada. And without going into huge detail on what it was, but it also provided the ability for better plans and processes and facilities. As we were starting the call as well, and mentioned to the group as well, that includes work for places like San Diego Airport on a new facility, but also a range of different facilities. So let's take that example and build upon that a bit more. Understanding through the pandemic, we've had lots of additional screen time. But one recommendation I would have is it's a bit of an older video, but Rick Burns' movie on the New York documentary film is definitely worth comparing to Vancouver because it hits at the point of how we see an economy that works for all, but also innovates. So the story here was basically like Vancouver, New York was and is a gateway city. You had a lot of sail ships going between different colonies that the Brits had, and there became a need to quickly fix broken sails. And from broken sails, there were skills developed to work with fabrics or 80 kind of fabrics to fix a rip, deal with the mass. And that eventually gave birth to New York's garment industry and the resulting areas of job creation in fashion. So the ability of looking at how key aspects of skills developed, but creating something from nothing is really part of the narrative to be able to look at this in terms of what are the mechanisms that we're creating in the future. And we're going to struggle with this because through the pandemic, the nature of work and the processes for how this comes together, it's changing and we don't exactly know what the demand will be. But it's also worth looking at some literature on this. The Brookings Institute, several years ago with Bruce Katz and Julie Wagner's work, it wrote extensively about the rise of innovation districts and comparing the different aspects of Boston, South Lake Union, and Seattle, their geographies of different ways innovation ecosystems work. And the general idea from their work is linking physical assets to economic assets and networking assets. And there are parallels with what we've heard already today. What are the mechanisms for disparate groups to actually meet and create and establish that commonality of networking in terms of idea creation? Last week, the Cascadia Innovation Corridor met in Vancouver. The collaboration between Oregon, Washington, BC, and Microsoft. And it's really fascinating listening to ideas and challenging this and the kinds of job types, the survey of employers around what do you think by job function you will be able to do remotely forever? Do you actually need to have a physical space to gather together in an office environment or other workspace? And arraying that across the entire narrative. And one of the companies, just taking a quote from Ryan Peterson from Unity, he's Victoria based, and he made the argument that in spite of everything, when you're trying to create new ideas, innovation is still an in-person activity. So then the question that Vancouver Plan needs to ask, answer, wrestle with is what are the models that could work in Vancouver? And in advance of this session, I know there were some questions asked around what can we learn from other cities? And definitely we could spend time enumerating exactly what others are doing. And one model, let's pick on Toronto, for example. Heather Reisman, Jerry Schwartz putting the Center for Artificial Intelligence at U of T, the 250,000 square feet of space for that center. It's additive to a couple million square feet that have been built for innovation centers. I would not argue at all that the hyper innovation spaces is at all appropriate. It's really about the quality of spaces as well as what exactly is the model in the public interest, as well as linkages to different kinds of things that are going to be very much unique to Vancouver in terms of our place in the world on what kinds of ideas can be created, whether it's social innovation, key areas on climate change, areas especially after the year we've had around climate change, forest fires, practices from different indigenous groups to learn from other ways of dealing with our natural environment. So there are definitely learning areas that could be advanced. So here are some ideas in terms of places that I've touched and built programming around this. So One of my favorite centers in Toronto is Artscape Daniels Launchpad, part of the waterfront area. It's got a not-for-profit together with a developer, federal, provincial, municipal support, along with other foundations. So it's an interesting facility because it's got a lot of attributes in terms of select area, whether you're into garment manufacturing or sound stage creation, video production, or other spaces. For my own organization, I had a global retreat for folks from Europe and other parts gathering to meet here to create new ideas. It was here that I brought forward the folks at Toronto's Billy Bishop Airport who are building an aggressive, sustainable airport ripe for the climate change issues impacting aviation. So a great idea space. Coincidentally, this is where The Weeknd has his recording studio, and it's the only place in Toronto The Weeknd will record from. So there's a very strong connectivity with performing arts. Another one that may be a completely different model, but this is something initiated from the city end of things. And what you're looking at is Boston District Hall, arguably the hub and the anchor for the Seaport District. And this is an area where it's an environment purpose-built by the city of Boston with not-for-profit operations as a gathering space. So if you're looking for the ability for networks to gather together and create new things, here's a great example of city investment, and the Brookings Institute certainly documented the anchor point of a transformational role in city building. And then lastly, Seattle South Lake Union, and certainly we have a lot of connectivity being close by, but it's not just Amazon. And Amazon, in fact, due to a number of issues, is actually headed to Bellevue. But here is where you have the Allen Institute for Brain Science, Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center, huge connectivity to UBC, and other aspects that are really part of the narrative of an innovation ecosystem. So in closing for this, the questions that we do need to ask in Vancouver Plan is, what is the model for innovation we are planning for? What are the future jobs and job spaces that we're going to be advancing? And I know our other speakers have very much talked about the missing middle on the residential side, as well as other aspects. Absolutely on board and fully in support of the ideas shared, but we also need to look and wrestle with how do we deal with the planning and design of innovation districts to be able to foster those spaces. And in the model, as outlined, we have creative people that can look at number one, the problem, two, the kinds of solutions, and three, transformative changes to be able to get the range of different interests, whether it's entrepreneurs, idea generators, funders together to be able to scale up what we offer as Vancouver to the word innovation. And of course, prefacing this by saying, I know it's an often overused buzzword, but one that absolutely has to figure into what we do next in Vancouver to make sure we have those spaces and opportunities for creation. Thank you.
Thank you. So some food for thought there. What kinds of innovation, at which kinds of innovation can Vancouver excel? What kinds of jobs and what kinds of economic activity will drive the city forward? And what kinds of places will help to make that happen? So, councillors, I would invite you, if you haven't already sent me questions, which a couple of you have, to put some questions in the chat and send them over to me. I will gather them up and redirect them to our panelists. I should mention also, by the way, I'm sorry that I didn't do this before, that we were supposed to have Jay Pitter with us tonight. And Jay has, unfortunately, has lost her voice. We discussed this before the meeting began, so I apologize for not mentioning it. But she's ill and is not talking right now, apparently. So yeah, it's a real loss that she's not here. But we will make do. So while I wait for a few more of your questions to roll in, I will let me ask the first couple that I have gotten. question from, excuse me for 1 minute. Oh, Council Hardwick has her hand up, looks like. So why don't we go to her to start with? Council Hardwick, you want to
Thank
begin?
you for not making me have to write out my questions and send them. So, Alex, I am familiar with your work, and the 15-minute city is an important concept that you analyzed last year in a Globe article.
Mm,
And Vancouver came up ahead of Toronto with 72% of residents living in amenity-rich blocks compared to 56% in Toronto.
right.
Looking a bit closer, I see that you compared the whole area of Toronto with Vancouver. And would it not have been a more apples to apples comparison if you compared old Toronto pre-1997 amalgamation with the city of Vancouver, since the land areas are much more comparable, as well as the period of historic development? What lessons can we take away from that analysis? Again, so everyone understands, Metro Toronto being 2.7 million population and Vancouver being like 0.7 population.
Right. So I guess the point you're driving towards, which I think is a good one, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it is the older areas of the city of Toronto, that the old city of Toronto, as it was before Toronto was amalgamated, is actually quite comparable to the current city of Vancouver. So apples to apples, you're looking at similar population, similar size. And Toronto, the old city of Toronto, is considerably more dense than Vancouver is, and also comes out ahead on these 15-minute city analyses. In other words, it's more walkable, it has more of a mix of uses, and has more people and more jobs in it than the areas that were built after that.
Indeed,
So,
and I'm just suggesting that if we're going to make comparisons like that, that I hate to come back to that, data and actual, legitimate comparisons. And I'll ask this question as I go through some of the other examples. For example, looking at Chicago as a comparison, which is an even bigger stretch than Toronto. But that's my initial question, and I will have others. Thank you.
thank you. So let me put this question to the panel, and feel free to jump on that, by the way, if you see any connections. Patty, in particular, if you see any connections here that you would like to make, as to why neighborhoods that were planned and built before the rise of the car essentially proved to be more dense, proved to have a larger mix, a greater mix of uses. And so a 15-minute city analysis sees them coming out ahead. Now, feel free to jump on that, but let me also bring another question to all of you. This one from Councillor Boyle. She is wondering, I'll just repeat the question. How do we how do councillors or how do leaders best engage residents in deciding on these challenges? And how do you ensure that incumbent homeowners and those who are currently comfortably housed don't get more say than those who are insecurely housed in those decisions? So would anyone like to speak to either of those two questions, the role of the historic city fabric or how to do consultation in a inclusive and equitable manner?
I think I can jump into the consultation piece, if that's okay. I think that this is one of the big questions that we are all are facing these days. How do we actually do truthful, meaningful engagement that is going to take in consideration all of the voices, and we're not going to be leaving anyone behind? The truth is that whenever we set our values in the framework that we want to be guided by, we are setting actually the groups of people that we're going to be prioritizing. This doesn't mean that we're not going to get to answer the needs and the challenges of people who probably haven't been hit that bad by the pandemic or other natural disasters, but we need to prioritize at this point people who were really suffering from these challenges. So to answer directly to the question, how do we do this? There's a couple of things that can happen. One of them is actually reaching out to equity seeking groups in a very thoughtful and meaningful way, meaning thoughtful and meaningful way that is not just to hear out what they are thinking, but actually to enabling them to have a voice and knowing and creating a strategy in which they're going to be leading the engagement process, and that they're going to be empowered to actually be part of the decision of the implementation process afterwards. It's very important that we don't just engage and then lose the connection and stop working with people. I think that this is one of the best things that I've learned from my work with engaging with especially operators with temporary modular housing. My job is not done whenever the project is done. It goes beyond that. You make a commitment that you're going to be hearing these voices and that you're going to be helping them. And no matter your role, and you need to ensure that you are supporting them in every single step of the way. So that's a commitment that I think that the City of Vancouver needs to make. If we're going to engage equity-seeking groups, underrepresented populations, how are we going to take them throughout the engagement process and into the implementation so that we are actually enabling them to create agency and stewardship in future projects?
Yeah, if I could just build on Patty's point, and just to be clear, as far as community engagement and public outreach, that's very much the core of how we practice as urban designers and planners. There are very few projects that do not involve the community and their input. I think, one of Patty's points are very important, to make sure that every voice is heard, but more importantly, those who are underrepresented, making sure their voice is heard. I think it's about identifying those groups that are actually working in the community and the groups that are actually working with the underserved. I think if they don't have a clear champion or clear voice, I would actually start there. That's basically how we actually started a number of our projects, whether it's being led by the public sector, Department of Planning, or working with a developer. We seek out those community groups or those agencies that are working with the underserved to really understand not only who has the voice or the voices, but more importantly, how we can actually reach them. And one of the things, especially when we do a lot of our master planning and mixed income housing, for us, it's not just checking a box. This is about creating a long range plan for the people. We often say, or I often say, that we have three different clients. We have clients such as yourselves, whether it's the city of Vancouver or a specific agency within a city. There's the developer that we may be working for. Those are our contractual clients. But as urban designers and planners, there's our third client, and that's the community. That's our spiritual client. And trust me, any one of those three can get you fired. So if you are a true practitioner who's really focused on creating change and being a change agent, we focus on that third non-contractual but spiritual client, and that's the community. And we often find that the best uh, ideas often do come from the residents because guess what? Guess what? They live there. They have insights that we can't see. They have insights that go well beyond anything that we can see in the physical environment, and certainly anything that we can glean from neighborhood indicators or the metrics, if you will. They allow us to look under the hood, and they also keep us honest as well. So we need that for a successful plan. I think Patty, and I'll stop talking after this, said it correctly. Our work is not done when our contractual obligation, it continues on. We be stewards of the environment, and that really is the foundation of making sure that that voice is community.
And I think to echo Andre's thoughts around how you actually get that engagement. And it's a local reference to both Vancouver and Toronto. But to get that engagement, you need to compare what was done with Regent Park in Toronto versus Little Mountain in Vancouver. Regent Park, for those who are not familiar with it, is very similar to the public housing tract. The approach in Vancouver was other reasons I'm quite familiar with by it, but it was invented. Toronto's Regent Park divided up the park 4 or 5 areas and really spoke to the residents who want the new Regent Park to be. And look at the product now, having Nelson Mandela School or a hardscape space nearby, and that microcosm of city building in terms of what we need to do better to be able to listen to the voiceless. Those are some things that we can add into how we actually look into the future.
Let me ask a different question. This one comes from Councillor Carr, which is, I suppose, related. She is wondering, looking at the challenge of trying to build in neighborhoods that have lost population, neighborhoods where the population has decreased. are there some good examples which have received broad public support of cities actually threading that needle? Cities figuring out how to add new density into neighborhoods that are in population decline. Anyone like to speak to that? Andre?
Yeah, I think there's some good examples that are out there, especially over the last 5 to 7 years. I think there's some great examples in Detroit, and this kind of builds on some of the work that Maurice Cox was doing when he was the planning director of planning there. There's some great examples also in Philadelphia that speak to this. But quite frankly, the lessons and those examples are few and far between. And I think this kind of gets to the idea of how we actually think about urban planning versus just one single development that stands on itself.
Right.
And how this actually builds that first investment builds off of that. I think one of the challenges with trying to invest in underserved communities, particularly those that have been losing population, is talking to developers and talking to also city agencies. Because we have to think about this in terms of both public and private. There's investment strategies that the public sector can certainly make, in terms of infrastructure in a number of these neighborhoods. Whether it's related to streets, infrastructure, transportation, but also the private development, the private developers. I think there's the idea of changing perception, where they think that there's no market. How do you actually, get beyond the numbers or market analysis to suggest there is a market or there can be a market if certain investments, are made? And I think that speaks to the spirit of how public and private sector could work together to try to alleviate some of those or change some of those perceptions. Because I think a lot of it does have to do with perception. And no one wants to be the first to go in once they actually see a neighborhood declining. They want to see that first successful model, whether it's the investment from the city or another developer before they put their toe in the water. But I think it really speaks to how the different agencies on the public sector, but also working with the private sector, could start to narrow that gap and change those perceptions.
Change those perceptions and sort of open the door to change. I guess, I mean, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it does seem to me that it's an excellent question that's obviously really topical, but it seems to me that there's a bit of a difference in the kind of cases you're talking about, Andre, and what Vancouver is facing. In that Chicago and Detroit as well, have something that is not so much present in Vancouver, which is really dramatic racial segregation. You have areas in Chicago that are very wealthy, and you have other neighborhoods which have been predominantly Black, which have seen disinvestment, and in which people are reluctant to invest, and in which people are reluctant to move. There are empty houses, empty blocks, which doesn't really exist in the Vancouver context. I mean, can we learn from that kind of experience of trends, creating new resources or perhaps transforming perceptions, something that can apply to a slightly different situation in Vancouver?
I'm sorry, is that question still geared at me or is that the
Yeah,
large?
I mean, if
I can certainly respond to that as well. I think if you look at what the city of Denver is doing,
Mhm.
not in terms of just managing their growth, but also thinking about urban design as a whole and what it means to their city, particularly some areas or neighborhoods that they feel have lacked investment. But again, um, Denver's also managing new population, new growth coming in
Mhm.
and trying to find ways to distribute that growth, but also not create additional displacement. I think they're putting in place some really interesting policies and also talking or staying very close to the private sector to talk about how they can distribute a development in a more equitable way. So I would really pay close attention to what Denver's doing. They don't have not been, if you will, kind of I won't say cursed, but dragged down by the legacy of segregation, as you mentioned, particularly racial and economic segregation in a lot of the Midwest cities here in the country. But I think Denver is a very good example to look at how they're actually going about doing it and trying to manage it.
Thank you for that. Questions now. Council Kirby Young has one, but let me just look through my chat here. Excuse me. Um, Two linked questions. One from Council Boyle. What role does non-market housing need to play? And what can local governments do to encourage an expansion of non-market housing within the city's own jurisdiction? And I think a related question coming from Councilor Swanson. how do you add density without bringing gentrification? Would anyone like to respond to one or both of those questions?
I feel like I've been talking quite a bit, so I'm going to let my esteemed colleagues here on the panel
Patty?
feel free to weigh in. So
Sure, I can I can jump in. The non-market question, that's very interesting. I think that there's, I mean, we're facing a moment where I mean, we can take the approach about, you know, the free market and letting the market actually regulate absolutely all of the housing that we have in Vancouver. That's one of the things that has been happening. But at the same time, there's this place that if we think about housing as a commodity, but if we think of housing as a human right, then there's a different approach to it. And I think that non-market housing actually plays that piece about housing as a right, and it can help to understand which are the neighborhoods, or it can help assist the neighborhoods that can be densified, that can be intensified, so that we can have options for different people in each and every neighborhood, and people can actually choose where they want to live in. The lack of non-market housing, I think that is what it's causing, is that it's homogenizing much more neighborhoods, and we are lacking the mechanisms to actually make sure that we have a wide diversity of people. And going back to the piece about like why do we actually want that diversity, amount of diversity of people, that's the core of creating resilience. So at the same time, non-market housing has to deal with the fact that if we're talking about supportive housing, if we're talking about assisted living as well, there's so much that supportive housing and assisted living can provide to the residents. So it's also up to the community and to the neighborhood services to be providing those extra services. If people have to travel 1 hour to actually get supportive services, then we are condemning them sorry, into a lifestyle that actually it's eventually, I mean, they might be ending up in the street again, or they might be moving from a neighborhood. So what's the option for actually helping people root themselves in a neighborhood? We provide supportive housing, we can provide shelter, we can provide supportive housing, we can jump into non-market and then affordable housing, but we need to fill the whole spectrum so that people can actually grow those bonds in the community. And then
I hear you saying two things here, Patty. One is that that continuum, and that by building housing for different people, you're benefiting not just the people who occupy that housing, but also other folks by allowing people options, right, and allowing them to move around. And do I hear
I'll
you?
add to that,
Go on,
if I
please.
might, as well, Alex, is I think one dimension that's also going to be quite critical is what kind of family affordability is also designed for the future. And that's also one area that is somewhat underserved. The Vancouver School Board has reported that through the pandemic, there's a 10% decline in enrollment year over year in the public system. That's a function of a number of different things. The parent of a 6 and 9-year-old, and a lot of classmates have gone to other parts of the world where, you know, my in-laws are in Halifax, so I'm going to go work from there, or the island. And so the nature of how do you actually make it livable in terms of communities while sustaining our public education system in terms of enrollment, that's also something that needs to be planned because of the imbalance that we have across the city in terms of where we actually have that affordability for families. It may very well be the changes and expectations around I'm going to grow up in a 3,000 square foot place in terms of the amount of space, but that makes it even more important then for the public assets and spaces and the quality of parks as well as recreation spaces. And those kinds of things also have to be thought through when we think about affordability.
So in other words, neighborhoods, you know, let's say theoretically that, you know, Shaughnessy has some empty schools, but a lot of parks, but not a lot of housing that's currently affordable to families and a shrinking population. Are you saying that that kind of neighborhood with that kind of profile would be an appropriate place to target new density and or non-market housing?
Absolutely, from subdivisions as well as existing assets are associated with available green space and some of the things that If you don't have a full backyard associated with where kids can go and play, then those public assets in terms of parks become even more important.
Mhm. Right. And Councillor Kirby Young had a question on this, and maybe we can come back to it. How do we, I'll paraphrase here a little bit, but given that people are going to be living in smaller footprints, for better and for worse, and quite literally in smaller spaces, how do we help people adapt to smaller living? And how important is the commensurate investment in public space in the public realm? And I guess I would add, what should that look like? So, how important is it to build public assets to meet density, and how might we go about doing that? Anyone?
Maybe I could start. I think it's absolutely critical. I think, as we are now on the other side of the pandemic here, or getting on the other side of the pandemic, hopefully, I think as it relates to residential development and what we actually call assets that we need in our community, it's certainly paramount in terms of identifying which ones we need to identify to actually get in the right neighborhoods. But as it relates to the unit itself, I think, as we start to think about, regardless of size of the unit, how we can actually make our living units more flexible and more adaptable, to, not only, accommodate, a live work balance, but also a learning balance, for our children. I think the other thing when we think about multifamily housing is what are the amenities that now would go in a multifamily building, or in an apartment or walk-up building. I think, the definition of amenities, has now evolved or is in the process of evolving. I think that's really going to be critical and key when we think about how we live in, what could be smaller units, but what still could be offerings that we actually have within, not so much a 15 or 20-minute walking distance of our front door, but literally going down the hall or down the corridor or to the ground level. Understanding what the amenities in these buildings are, regardless of the scale of the residential unit, I think is really going to be something that we all really need to be paying close attention to.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think it's important to mention here that the downtown Vancouver has been very good at that. The
Yes, you
Larry
have.
you know, Larry Beasley's kingdom, has been a leader in that respect. So, and I guess perhaps here we're talking to a degree about what intensification might look like in the rest of the city, and what kind of forms it might take and where it might go. Um, I'm going to
Alex,
ask,
if I may quickly just jump into that.
please.
Yeah, there's just this piece about that. This is an excellent question, because how do we actually convince people that living in a multi-unit environment might
Yeah,
be better than living in a single family home?
Yes.
So data is starting to show, and from the work that I used to do with the Happy City team, that people in living connected environments are more likely to be resilient and have emergency contacts in case of an emergency. They are more likely to recover from a heart attack. They are less likely to suffer cancer as well. I mean, there's research that connects the different sciences that is allowing us to understand that connected people actually have access to better lives. So
right.
it's about changing. How do we create this awareness so that we understand that it actually is helping us to move into a more like into life quality? It might be less comfortable, but comfortable is not necessarily the equivalent of health and inclusion. And in that sense, I think that we have been relying too much in public spaces. Yes, I'm a big advocate of public spaces and how they can bring the community together. Those are the spaces where we actually express our opinions, where we show our identity, where we come closer together. But housing, we have been spending up to 24 hours in our homes, and we are losing some of the most important opportunities here. What if we start thinking about the circulation space that it's gonna go up to in between 15 and 20% to actually create opportunities for social encounters? It was the people that were living in low-rise neighborhoods with a balcony that were part of the pandemic cheer at 7 o'clock every single day. And we have been learning that if we understand what are the types of amenities that are not like the typical gym, the typical space that is going to be mostly empty, but if we actually engage residents into deciding what are the types of homes that they want, and don't just leave it to the development market to determine what's going to happen, we might have a better shot at actually addressing what residents want, and then creating a connection in between what is just for residents and what is open to the community. So from the design perspective, also creating a transition space in between the public realm and those private spaces, that is where we actually have this sense of we are connected with life outside, and we just feel better, like in terms of serotonin levels, they increase.
Thank you for that. I just had a conversation earlier today with a London architect called Paul Karakusevich, who has worked on a number of estate renewal schemes, the redevelopment or renovation of social housing in the city of London, and he was talking very much along these similar themes. I would just point out, though, that the in order to establish a range of public and private spaces and to talk about a transition between public space and private space, you're implying larger projects. A triplex does not have a courtyard, right? I mean, to a certain degree, the kinds of thinking that you're describing here, Patty, really applies to buildings that are big, or at least bigger than a single lot in scale. So maybe that's useful, right? That with scale comes opportunities to do stuff as well as challenges. Councillor Weeb, I think, has. Let's see, where are you?
I'm here.
Are you here, Councillor Weeb? You have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah. My question is really on the connected environments and the importance of health and well-being. We're seeing around the world a huge movement of well-being budget frameworks, on donut cities, on other ways of really redesigning not only the financial elements, but how we do create those connected communities, how higher towers, how much green space, and how it all connects. Can you talk a little bit about what type of framework we should be bringing in the Vancouver plan, looking at some of those really big ideas? I know Toronto's looking at the donut city, so is Nanaimo. We're seeing kind of a movement around the world looking more larger and holistically about how we can build our cities within the world ecological footprint. So it'd be great to hear from some of the panelists on how we're looking at how well-being as an outcome in our city building and how we think we're going to get there with land use.
Interesting. Solomon, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I mean, from the context of what I was trying to describe in terms of the built form around the work environment, it becomes even more important around how disconnected we have been physically with folks that are nestled away in terms of our own areas. I think I fully agree with what Patty you described in terms of people are holed up in their places 24/7. But as we get out of the pandemic and start looking at that, it's really the quality of spaces that are going to be within residential areas or focused areas in terms of the work environment. How do we create those opportunities for those encounters to be able to have different schools of thought come together as well as interact with each other? And those are a mix of intentional spaces to be able to foster some of those aspects. But the other thought process there is the ability to then to also build upon what Vancouver has been excellent at in terms of not having a complete set of bedroom communities. When I go to different cities in the United States right now, complete ghost town in most downtown cores. The feedback I got from folks coming in from Seattle, Portland, and other places last week for the Cascadia Innovation Corridor was just glee looking at how lively, even during the pandemic, our downtown environment is. So to capitalize on that, but then also build those intentional spaces for collaboration to occur and defining that in quantities that will be able to create those opportunities to mix individuals from different walks of life and different approaches together. Those are some general ideas that we're missing right now in terms of how we've established our spaces that we develop.
Councilman. Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
No, please continue.
No, I'll, if you don't mind, I'll just be very brief. I really appreciate you asking this question. We are doing some work with the city of Singapore and also in conversations with the city of Chennai in terms of the idea of kind of talking about public realm and what it means in terms of health and wellness and the need to invest in that now. And what it also means in terms of just kind of everyday life, in terms of quality of life. And the interesting thing that we've been talking about, particularly in Chennai, in India, is the idea of, what it means in terms of a person's day in a life, in terms of access to open space, access to a variety of open spaces, whether it's regionally or whether it's within that 15-minute walk of their front door. And it's interesting to hear that now there's been more talk and more focus, particularly with a lot of these global cities or emerging cities, and the idea of what open space really means and how that needs to be leveraged, not only with new development, but also the existing urban infrastructure as they really start to rethink, different parts of their city from an urban design and planning standpoint. But I think it's incredibly important. We've all, as Patty said, we've been locked up here for the past 21 months. And those moments of actually interaction and how we interact with each other, that goes beyond just kind of the physical well-being, but also the mental health as well. So, I think it's all tied together. And I think it's really something that we need to really start thinking about in terms of how do we actually create policy that's really focused around that and really start to merge that clear gap that we've all witnessed over the past and felt over the past 21 months in terms of health and wellness and our investment in our open spaces and the public realm.
So if I can paraphrase a little bit here, you're suggesting perhaps that the city could take inventories of where access to open space, parks, or other sorts of amenities are available, and try and link up new growth with that. Put new people in places where they have access to those kinds of amenities. Is that right?
Yeah, and actually, I would say expand the definition of what it means in terms of health and wellness as it relates to our open spaces and our infrastructure. It goes beyond just parks, it goes beyond pocket parks, it goes beyond regional parks. But what does that really mean in terms of how this actually impacts everyone from age 5 to 50 or 8 to 80? Because it means different things to different people, regardless of what city we're in. So I think this is an opportunity for us to all kind of reset what this means in terms of our urban environments as it relates to our cities and how they could actually continue to emerge and evolve.
If I can add to this, this is such an important question. Thank you, Councillor Grebe, for bringing it up. And I think that there's an opportunity this, but I'm also going to talk about the tension that it holds about creating kind of like a well-being framework for the entire city. I think that a well-being framework for the entire city could actually create common ground. If we look at it from the engagement perspective, it's about the first thing to get on a kind of like on the same agenda or on the same page is not talking about the strategies and actions that are going to be developed, but talking about the values that we want to embrace. And from the work that I've been doing in the past, what we have learned is the well-being framework for a community is not exactly the same for another community. It has to be flexible, and it has to and we need to understand what's the pathway that leads each community to well-being. So while one community might be more focused on health, accessibility, resilience, another community might be more focused on starting with safety or maybe with meaning and belonging. So it depends on the community and the neighborhood and what they have experienced in the past that we can build a framework that actually works for the entire city and that can be building on the healthy city net framework that has already been created. And then from there, understand what are the needs of each one of the different communities that are part of the city. So I think that this is a great opportunity to hold the tensions, but at the same time, we need to commit, if we're committing to a well-being framework, it's about how do we identify the values, then how do we translate this to strategies, and then how do we translate this to actions? And overall, what is this intersection in between equity, resilience, and reconciliation? That intersection that is going to allow us to identify those 5 out of 50 actions that need to be the first ones to be prioritized.
Thank you.
Is this perhaps a good time to bring up SINOC and the other large indigenous-led projects that are happening in the city? I mean, SINOC in particular um, is a very unusual project in a number of ways. It's intended to deliver, in part, affordable housing to members of the Squamish Nation. It is extremely light on car infrastructure, and it delivers much more density, much more residential density than the city's planning would contemplate in that location, which is, on the doorstep of downtown, and yet not zoned for high rises. Is there as I've written, I've made this clear, I think it's, a really enticing model in a lot of ways. I mean, do we agree? And are there lessons that could be learned there for the rest of the city, and the different contexts that exist across the rest of the city?
I'll take a stab at this, Alex. I think it's a good question you raise because it's really the aspect of the opportunity that we have in terms of looking at the major areas, whether it's Jericho lands or other parcels that provide the ability to demonstrate different types of the built form. I think one of the areas that I would also characterize with larger density projects, it's an opportunity to actually take a look at the public realm. One example I've cited is take a look at San Francisco's mission-based school. And the mission-based school is fascinating because some of the themes that we've talked about in terms of a program of a community asset for learning, an elementary school, as well as a hub for additional idea generation. It's some of these areas provide the opportunity to break apart some of the different tracks of enabling the social and learning opportunities. But I think the ability of understanding that in terms of aligning density to potential school parks and other public facilities, those are really things for us to be able to define a newer form and certainly from a reconciliation point of view, provides that opportunity to showcase learnings that are not necessarily built around new ideas, but also taking and reflecting from within. And those are some aspects that have to be figured into the planning at a more detailed level in terms of some of those larger planning exercises that each neighborhood could adapt and build in.
Good. So I just want to flag that we have about roughly 5 minutes before I'm going to loop back to the panelists for their kind of closing remarks, and then leave it with the deputy mayor to wrap up. So councillors, anyone who hasn't asked a question yet, I would especially welcome you to step in right now. And I actually can't see clearly who has their hand up. So Andrew, perhaps you can cue me if other councillors are now raising their hands.
I am also just following hands from my screens, and I think Councillor Hardwick has been waving for a while, just to know.
Thanks, Denise. Yes, she has. I just want to see whether there's anyone who hasn't spoken yet who'd like to get into questions since we only have a couple of minutes left before I loop back to Councillor Hardwick. Anybody else?
I'd
No?
just like to point out that I'm in one of those intergenerational living situations here, which is one of the reasons if I wasn't going to be able to ask another question, I was going to leave a little early. But if you'll indulge me, I have a question for Solomon. You started off your presentation about Vancouver as a gateway city. And indeed, we exist. We're the terminus of the railway. We're the western point, port to the Pacific. So have you, as we look at our economic diversification, it's been said by the new head of Invest Vancouver that the city and the region is in an existential crisis as we've shifted since the 80s in our dominance of natural resource extraction industries and related to the current economy, which is very focused on real estate property development and construction. So the question that is being asked there, and is one that I've asked of, are you familiar with Danny Bresnitz's book, Innovation in Real Places? Danny Bresnitz is the head of the Monk School of Innovation at the University of Toronto. And he talks about the need to be fostering innovation and entrepreneurship in hubs of areas that are distinct to the locale. So as we look to the future of our economy, I mean, there's all these great targets that, but no one's really talking about what jobs and what industries people are going to be working in, which is kind of existential. So my question to you then is, how do you see it? One of the things Bresnitz warns against, again, is the tendency to become a Silicon hyphenate, or in our experience, a Hollywood North hyphenate, where we're very mobile jobs that can go anywhere, and there's a lot of competition. So from your perspective, focusing on innovation and economic development, where do you see that focus needing to be in the Vancouver plan?
So I think there are a couple of answers I would have to that. I go back to 1989 when the former Macmillan Bloedel had an innovation lab in Burnaby, just outside Vancouver, and it created 3 distinctive products. Best recycling method for cardboard boxes, parallel in terms of built form, in terms of wood beams as strong as steel. And then there was a decision made by Maclo to just close that innovation center. And the public bodies of the time let that happen because it was just easier to send natural resources somewhere else and keep the flow going. And that's the heart of the challenge for Vancouver in terms of how do we actually create some of those kinds of things that will be game changers in terms of things that are true to our values in the region as well as what unique competences we have. Folks in the region have created major changes in social innovation, have created additional areas to be able to affect changing climate change and energy use. And I think the ability to harness small scale and large scale innovation in the spaces that matter is really what needs to be fostered and provide that platform so that our region, our country, our province is not stuck forever in natural resources as really the only major force and some of the creative economies that can really glue together graduates from Emily Carr together with ideas people defining the problems. But it takes that connectivity to get the spaces for those quality conversations to occur to create some of those outcomes. And so I think it's a long-winded piece around we can't let that example of the 1989 Innovation Lab disappear again. It's been some time. And some of the role of the city around what is it that we need to actually structure becomes part of that challenge to enable us to compete more effectively on the global stage.
Solomon, if I could add to that point, I think you said something that's been key. We're actually, or I'm actually involved in working on a couple of, if you will, kind of innovation districts, in 2 cities in the country. And the one message that we've been repeating is that innovation can happen. And I think you captured it correctly and well. It can happen and should happen in a city like Vancouver at all scales. You know, uh, as you all know, everyone's been looking to, or a number of cities been looking to repeat kind of the successes of Kendall Square, or what's been happening in the Triangle District in North Carolina, or San Diego or the Bay Area. Well, a lot of that is not, cannot be transferred to another city. So I think, it's the idea of actually, building on the strengths of your region and the strengths of your city and what that means in terms of innovation going into the 21st century. Because what's innovation is innovative today in 2021 is going to be much different in 2025. And I think, to your point, Solomon, you're right, not relying on that single driver of innovation that really is reflective of, not only addressing some of the issues that you face as a region or city, but how you can actually be more competitive, if you will, with your adjacent cities on the West Coast, and also nationally and globally as well. So the ideal, I think, in terms of flexibility, in terms of innovation at all scales, that doesn't necessarily have to happen in one place, I think is very important when a city is talking about how to think about innovation through development and innovation districts as a whole.
Thank you. I think now I'm just going to change tack a little bit because we have a question from Councillor Fry, which is an interesting one. I'd also invite Councillor Dominato. Feel free to throw in a question. Maybe we can squeeze that in before we wind up. But here's one from Councillor Fry. He asks, "What is the role of built form? We hear about towers and social isolation, and that ground-oriented buildings help engender community. Do you have thoughts, reflections on new forms, particularly of projects that are revitalization projects like Regent Park?" So would anyone like to speak to that? Patty.
Sure, thank you. Yes, definitely. The built form has great impact in the way that we're going to be building resilience in our community, the way that we're going to be connecting people. If we look at this from the social isolation, from the loneliness approach, but also from the climate change action and also from the affordability piece, it makes sense that we're focusing on buildings that are low rise and mid rise and not skyscrapers that might be intensifying places in the city. Adding to this from the dive that I took into some of the conversations that are emerging from the Vancouver plan, people are actually interested in having this kind of developments, a little bit of like low density, like maybe having like 3 or 4 buildings, 3 or 4 stories. And 3 or 4 stories, there's a rationale why this provides more contact and a close connection with the public. Usually it is based also, for instance, theaters. You decide that the farthest person away from the theater is 25 to 30 meters. It's the same rationale. If you design so that we are in contact for 25 to 30 meters, you still have an opportunity to actually look at faces and sense that familiarity of what's happening. And that familiarity is what gives us starts giving us a sense of belonging. So definitely the build form in terms of height has an important role in building more connected communities, but also in the transition. I'm gonna kind of like go back to this transition. It doesn't matter if it's a duplex or if it's a 6 to 8 story building. The transition that we can create with stoops, with the threshold in between the sidewalk and the building, maybe 3.5 meters that people have been activating during the pandemic to have community gardens. If we have the right amount of balconies so that we are also ensuring that people have this outdoor safe space that was much needed in the pandemic, but also helps to connect with neighbors and things that are happening outside, then we're moving into a more sustainable, in the 3 ways of understanding sustainability, into a better world, from the affordability piece, from the environmental piece, and from socially connected section. You're muted, Alex.
I think you're muted.
So I am, second time. Sorry, guys. I would, I'm not sure whether I'm agreeing or disagreeing with your point here, Patty. I think I'm agreeing, but I have found it interesting as a journalist to explore the idea of social resilience. And and it is sometimes the case that people in denser communities actually have higher experience that quality that you were just talking about, in a more intense way as well. Having a lot of neighbors is not necessarily a route to having fewer social connections. In fact, it can be a route to having more social connections. But I guess if I understand you correctly, you feel that really it's the specific arrangement of built form and the relationship between buildings and their surroundings that creates those relationships. Is that correct?
Correct. There's another component that is going to be crucial. Our ability to control our social exposure was very different in between people living in dense environments during the pandemic and that felt unsafe, other than the people that were living in dense environments but were able to control that social exposure. So that agency comes back to place.
I think Patty said something that's very important that I was going to speak to as well. As she talked about different examples. As far as the built form goes, especially as it relates to city government, particularly planning departments, we have to allow for flexibility, and the idea of flexibility in the built form. I think one of the criticisms that I often have with, form-based code as it's been applied is that it's been so rigid. And this is not saying this in defense of developers, who have to respond to form-based code that's been implemented by a number of city agencies. I think in some places it plays out very well. Other times I feel like it really constrains the product. And it's not so much in terms of the flexibility from a developer, but it's really flexibility for the end user. So I think that we need to think about, as it relates to the built form, there needs to be a number of things that we need to offer on the menu in terms of how we can actually really impact, our built environment. And then what does that mean in terms of flexibility, that not only we keep in mind the end user, but there are users, there'll be a number of different end users.
Oh, I think we're losing you, Audrey.
I'm back. Not sure
Now
what I
you're
cut
back.
off, but I'm sure my time was
Yep.
over. So.
All right, so yeah, I mean, maybe we'll leave it there because I see we're now at 7:52, which means that I'm a little bit late in getting to the wrap up point here. So maybe if you don't mind, panelists, we can just take a couple of minutes to collect some of the thoughts that we have brought together here and some of the things that have come out of the questions. So, Patty, perhaps I'll start with you. What do you think are, having had this discussion, what do you think are some of the key takeaways you would like council and city staff to come away with?
Sure. I have three. I think that I have three. Nothing for the community without the community. Let's engage people throughout the creation of the plan and empower them to also steward during implementation. Prioritize underserved and most vulnerable populations. Their voice needs to take up more space and actions need to be prioritized so that we can address historical inequities. And the third one would be yes to more density, yes to missing middle. Also, let's look at the quality and the design of these buildings to ensure that we are maximizing opportunity so that we can connect people and build resilient communities.
Thank you.
Okay,
Um,
Alex, excuse me just
yes.
1 second. I do have to interrupt because our meeting will absolutely end at 5 unless I receive a motion to extend. Can you give me an estimation on the amount of time? Do you think 10 minutes or something like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just gonna ask Solomon and Andre to wind up quickly and then pass over to the deputy mayor for a
Okay.
resolution to attend the
Okay,
meeting, if that's
thank you,
okay.
thank you. I think I'm going to get a motion or ask for a motion to extend by
Motion to
10
extend.
minutes. Council?
Councillor Carr, I'm happy to move
Thank you.
to extend
Thank you,
to your
Councillor
closing
Boyle.
comments.
I'll need a seconder for that. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Kirby Young. All those in favor say aye.
All right.
Any opposed say nay. Okay, you have another 10 minutes, Alex.
Okay. Well, hopefully we're not going to need it. We'll try and be timely and not stretch into people's afternoons too far. So maybe Solomon, let's go to you. Having heard this conversation, what would you like folks to leave with as the plan moves forward?
I think the ability to make sure that we have spaces that work for all, that have that economic strategy for what we think the job base will look like going into the future. We're going to go through a hybrid model for quite some time in terms of the way of working. That being said, I think the ability to create those intersections for folks that can come at this from different directions, come at it from a sustainability lens, social, economic, environmental, from a reconciliation end, but also the core driver is that it's penultimately important for the city to foster the idea creation and create those spaces to allow those kinds of interaction to occur and create new things that can absolutely be shared with the world to be able to help solve a lot of the common problems we have from our microcosm in Vancouver to help deal with a range of societal as well as economic problems that we're going to be facing in the coming years. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. So yeah, Andre, it looks like you will have the last word.
I'll be very brief here, and hopefully I won't lose my connection. But I think doubling down on one of Patty's points, capturing the voice of the underserved is incredibly important. And I think if you want to think about the future of your city, finding ways to be very deliberate and also intentional. And I think that's the key word, intentional, about how you engage and capture the voice of the underserved is very important. They're much smarter than we all realize. They are the experts in their community. And I truly believe this. The best ideas often do come from the residents in their community. Second, something that I'm somewhat obsessed with of how do we actually narrow the gap between design and public policy. I think you have an opportunity to really be a model here globally of how you can actually think about the built form, but also balance public policy that's being driven by the key decision makers in local government. And how do we actually, talk about a more integrated way of how we actually talk about the built environment where design does not solve everything. And is trained as an architect and urban designer. I'm the first person to say that. But also on the other side, policy cannot drive everything either. So how do we actually narrow that gap where there's more of a merging of those ideas and those makers to really create a new urban environment? I think you have a great opportunity in Vancouver. You've been a leader in so many different ways as it relates to thinking about city-wide planning, and it's going to be interesting to see how your plan for the future really evolves.
Indeed. Great place to leave it. Thank you all for your participation. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've had some fun sitting in the moderator's chair. So I'll pass it over to Deputy Mayor Carr for a motion to adjourn.
Great, thank you. And I'll just give a few comments first.
Please.
This does conclude our dialogue on the Vancouver plan today. I think potentially, do you have comments from some staff? No, good. I would like to thank then Alex Bozakovich for his expert moderation of today's event. You did a great job. Thank you. And thank each of the panelists as well for your time and participation. Patty Rios, Andre Broomfield, and Solomon Wood, thank you for sharing your experience and ideas with us at Council. So, Council, that does conclude our business on today's agenda. I'm now looking for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hardwick, and I think a seconder came from Councillor Kirby Young. So could all those in favor say aye?
Aye.
Any opposed say nay? This motion is carried unanimously, and this special committee of Council is now adjourned.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very much.